So what is what was called the one big beautiful bill that's now law?
So the boilerplate or the simple version is that it's this big, well, now law, it's not a bill, right? It's this big law that is Donald Trump's sort of big legislative victory. And in it, he just outlines all the ways he wants to change the way the government spends money. Mm-hmm. There's a lot in it, and the reason why it is called the Big Beautiful Bill is it's about 900 pages long. I guess to break it down, there's sort of like, let's just explain really quick why what this bill is and why it happens. So every year, right, Congress, they're elected to look at the budget for the whole country, essentially, and figure out how much we're already in deficit. And so what people don't realize is the United States is unique in that we actually borrow money.
We run
on deficit. So we borrow money from foreign powers, from treasuries, et cetera, et cetera. And so we borrow money. But because we borrow money, we have to figure out every year, by we, I mean Congress has to figure out every year, how much can we borrow? And how much can we afford so that we don't default on all of our loans? Mm-hmm. And so understanding that that's what the whole point of this spending bill is, which is something that kind of happens almost every year, the bill had 4 aims to it. One, there were some tax cuts implemented in 2017, and they were supposed to expire. And so the first aim of that bill was to make those tax cuts permanent. And while that sounds really great, those tax cuts mostly benefit the rich. I'm not going to benefit all that much from it. The average person's not going to benefit all that much for it.
Unless you believe in trickle-down
economics. Right, but I feel like since Reagan, we've learned that absolutely is not the case.
Yeah, and that's why the Congressional Budget Office is projecting that this bill will add $3.4 trillion to the deficit in a decade. So if the wealth was trickling down and it was good for the economy, why is it multiplying the deficit?
Exactly. And so we have that first set of tax cuts. And then Trump wanted to institute more tax cuts, which benefits big business. It benefits the wealthy. And so that's another set of tax cuts.
And within that is like a small little tax cut for tips.
For the average person will maybe see an impact, but not that much.
Yeah.
The third thing the Big Beautiful Bill, now law, wanted to do was increase spending for national security. But when they say national security, they're really thinking like Border Patrol, ICE, Department of Homeland Security, and increasing that budget in like more than 100%. Billions and billions of dollars going that. And then the last thing they wanted to do was, like I said, raise the debt ceiling, which is to say that, we need to be able to borrow more. And so what does that all mean? The thing is, if you cut taxes, but we have all these federal programs, that means we won't have the money coming in to pay for everything. So how are Republicans planning to pay for everything? The answer is they're not planning to pay for anything.
Yeah, and even to call it, quote unquote, cutting taxes, if the rich don't pay their taxes. Let's just call it what it is. Yeah. Because corporations like Amazon, Walmart actually pay less in taxes than folks like you and I.
Yeah.
And they're not paying their fair share. And that's in part what increases the national deficit. I mean, I want to read some quotes from experts on this and other elected officials. So Senator Bernie Sanders said, "This is not a budget," quote, "it's a declaration of war on working families while billionaires get richer." Robert Reich, who's the former Secretary of Labor and a professor and economist, said, quote, "This is the largest redistribution of wealth in American history, from the poor to the working class to the rich." And people are calling this the Great American Heist, mass this policy.
Yeah, so basically the government, I don't think people fully realize how all the taxes pay for everything. But where most of that money, like you said, comes from corporations, comes from the wealthy, but they're not paying the taxes now. So where are we getting the funds for the increased military budget? Where are we getting the funds for ICE? Well, what the government decided to do is to cut funding to a lot of government programs that were actually the safety net for the average citizen, for the average American, for the average person on this soil. So what's happening is the rich aren't having to pay taxes, but the poor are losing their safety nets.
Yeah.
Safety nets like Medicaid.
Yeah, $1 trillion in Medicaid reductions, and it reintroduces the work requirement.
Yeah.
That will also have an impact. An estimated 12 million Americans will be uninsured by 2034. And even the American Hospital Association said that the financial strain from this bill will cause widespread layoffs and closures of low-income clinics and nursing homes. I mean, they're estimating that hundreds of nursing homes will close because of the Medicaid funding that they receive for patients.
Right. And I don't think people realize that we're talking a lot about the numbers right now, but there's already a disparity in health across communities of color versus those who are in communities that are wealthier. And so what's going to happen is if people don't have Medicaid, which is a safety net, right? It provides supposedly affordable, or at least more affordable, health care to those who don't have a lot of income. People are just going to go undiagnosed. People are going to be afraid to rack up bills. And what we're going to see is the disparity between health in communities that have wealth and those that don't are going to become even wider. And that's just sad to see because that impacts families. It impacts the future.
Some politicians even call this a death sentence for some, literally at the cost and expense to give more tax cuts to the rich, people who already have it. So it's like instead of helping the person who might need, to pay for their medication for insulin and diabetes or to pay for surgery, we're helping someone get their third private jet. And tax breaks is where they can get another yacht or something like that.
And Medicaid isn't the only place where they're, at least when it comes to health, where money is being cut.
Right.
In terms of women's health, there's a provision in it where insurance companies that refund or cover abortions or anything like that, while federal funding already, because of overturning Roe v. Wade, won't go to that, if an insurer has subsidies from the government, but they insure women or anybody who has a uterus and allows for reproductive health care that includes abortion, they're disincentivized to provide that coverage.
Wow.
And so even if you're in a state where maybe there's some reproductive health care, now your insurer may not cover it. And that's far from a, inexpensive process. And so what we'll see is people, either we'll see that abortion will become another topic again in terms of, people getting it done illegally, or where can they go, or do women have resources now? Or not just women, anyone, with a uterus.
Right. Yeah. All over the healthcare industry, from insurance, even big pharma.
Yeah.
They're getting lots of welfare and tax breaks. Let's call this what it is. It's corporate welfare. So big pharma. Drugs for rare conditions are going to be exempt from pricing constraints, and this will allow drug makers to retain over $5 billion in what would have otherwise gone to taxpayers.
Yeah.
So these multi-billion-dollar big pharmaceutical companies who use the government grants for research to develop their drugs in the first place now have less constraints and can charge what they want more so. And there's just less restrictions, no oversight.
Right. And I've heard these sort of not so great criticisms of those who say, well, the bill works for me. Well, that's great for you. But there's also been this thing that, hey, well, then you know what? Maybe become the wealthy so it does affect you.
Right.
Well, one of the number one ways to sort of move up, quote unquote, in terms of economics, in terms of financials, is to get an education. And education is supposed to be the gateway, right, supposedly, to the upper echelons. But even considering that already the government was trying to shut down the Department of Education, what we're seeing now when it comes to higher education is that the Pell Grant, which for those who don't know, the Pell Grant is a form of funding that does not have to be repaid.
That's how I got through undergrad.
Yeah, see, while the Pell Grant, they want to decrease funding to the Pell Grant and then make it harder to qualify for the Pell Grant.
You have to be full-time, essentially.
You have to be full-time. But the thing is, those who need the grant the most are usually those who are studying while working full-time or while having to take care of their families or whatnot. And so having to increase your course load on top of a workload and trying to get by makes it even more difficult. And then if you were to go and get federal student loans, they're capping that now. Right. They're capping it at $100,000 for, I believe, for undergrad and $200,000 for grad school. And at a time when the price of education is so expensive.
I had to take out more than $200,000 to get through grad school, law school and everything. So I literally wouldn't have been able to get through, even though I think they're going to make an exception for professional law schools and medical schools. I think the average med student graduates with like 50% more than that. I think almost $300,000 in debt. So it's like literally, students can't fund their education in the United States, by the way.
In the United States.
And in other countries, you can go to medical school for free, you know. But the elimination of this Grad Plus loan or capping it at $200,000 is going to impact lots of students.
And then for those who, like me, still have a student loan to repay, first of all, congratulations. I know you paid off your student loan.
Thank you. Yeah, in the nick of time, literally in January.
You did.
If it would have been 4 weeks later, I would have been swept up in all of this.
Yeah, and so what's going to happen to me is I'm going to have to decide how I'm going to repay that student loan. Because there used to be, I think, about 10 to 12 options for how to repay a student loan. You know, and the idea for there being so many options is that you shouldn't have to break the bank to pay back this loan. And so
you shouldn't have to break the bank for the bank.
Exactly. And so it's supposed to be that, you know, there were a lot of repayment options that people rely on that are income-based. But what's going to happen is they're removing that option. And so a lot of student loans are going to have to turn into the standard 10 to 25 year. But for some people, if I got my loan, if I had to pay that at the very beginning of me getting that, like having to pay that loan, that would mean that my monthly payment was somewhere between $600 and $800 per month.
Yeah.
And that is a lot of money.
It would have been thousands for me. I remember, I mean, I did income-based repayment for 10 years, and that's how I got my loans forgiven. But I remember when they gave me 2 quotes, they said, all right, here's paying, 10% of your income, which I paid, which is a fair amount to pay for your loan, right?
Sure.
If 10% for your income for loans, you might spend 20% on housing and just other things. So, but they estimated, said, all right, you pay 10%, maybe that's, between $700 and $900 a year. Yeah. They said, however, if you were to just pay this off in 20 years, you would have to pay about $4,000 a month. And I said, oh, you mean like all my salary?
Yeah, exactly.
That's what you would want. For,
it was already untenable paying back student loans, and now they're making it even harder. And so what's happening is the pressure is on a lot of these debt collectors now to like, oh, we're going to be able to collect on all these defaulted loans. And so while the federal government is increasing their debt ceiling, what they're also doing is increasing the debt for the actual
people.
For the actual people.
It's like a betrayal of not just the working class, but lots of Americans for the banks. Like this one was actually really particularly cold, the elimination of deferment for unemployment and financial hardships. If you're unemployed or you can't actually pay your loan, traditionally, you can defer it until you're in a situation where you can pay it. So you don't have to starve yourself to pay these banks. But now they're seeking to eliminate that, and this will definitely deter future doctors, lawyers, and others.
Yeah, there are going to be people who have the smarts, have the ability, have the will, the drive to put themselves through school, but won't be able to because the barrier is financial. Problem is people think that, well, if we're divided, we're divided. Who cares? Well, it matters because the people at the top are the ones who are in charge, and they're the ones draining our pockets for their own.
Right. It's a lot going on. Let's talk about 2 ways this bill is unprecedented.
Sure.
One of the ways you mentioned, talk about the immigration enforcement. $170 billion for immigration enforcement, some for detention, some to hire thousands of ICE agents, making ICE the largest federal law enforcement agency, surpassing the FBI, CIA, and others.
Yeah.
Literally more than doubling their budget. Billions of dollars to create more privatized detentions that people within Trump's cabinet and administration literally profit from and benefit from. We're hearing about the human rights violations in places like Alcatraz Alley in Florida, what they're calling it, where it's basically a tent concentration camp where people are drinking out of toilet bowl water and different things like that. And even with that, they're now signaling that they're going to invest more into this immigration infrastructure to house or warehouse, rather, over 100,000 people at any given time.
Right. I think the current budget for just detention centers and anything related to that is $45 billion, right? $45 billion dollars. So they're spending $45 billion on what are essentially concentration camps, which is such a farce because, not to digress too far because we're talking about this bill, but we're not seeing a lot of due process.
Oh, no.
So these detention centers, while they say it's so that they can hold people so that they can, before they can go to a hearing, what we're really seeing is that they're being detained. They're being detained in inhumane conditions and then just deported. So $45 billion, and that's $45 billion that's being taken away from Medicaid, $45 billion that's being taken away from Department of Education, $45 billion that's being taken away
from environmental justice, green
U.S.
energy
citizens, from those in this country. So, not to digress too far because we're talking about the, big, beautiful bill. But I think we should really highlight that $45 billion for detention centers alone, out of all of the other, ways you are going to spend money in terms of defense or immigration policy, is notable because detention centers are internment camps, are concentration camps, and there are already people there. And U.S. officials have been allowed to tour them. And after touring them, so many people were appalled by the inhumane conditions. So we're spending $45 billion to kidnap and then detain all of these immigrants. And let's not feed into the rhetoric. They're not just waiting for due process. A lot of them will not get put in front of a judge or get a hearing. They're going to be deported. And this is what we're spending money on. We're not spending money on a pathway to immigration. We're not spending money on those in this country who really need help. We're spending money to remove people just because they weren't born here.
Right. And we're
$45 billion.
$45 billion. We're spending,
and that's just detention.
Yeah, that's just the detention centers.
Yeah.
$50 billion for new border wall construction along the southern border, the U.S.-Mexico border.
Yeah.
And some of those go to construction companies that have connections to politicians and others. And they haven't even done the studies yet for the environmental impact on these construction sites, but they're passing these billions of dollars. And then also $30 billion for ICE agencies to hire thousands of ICE officers.
The money, the way it was touted as, we're spending money on security, national security, that's the buzzword that makes people feel like, oh, this is good spending. But you're essentially funding a law enforcement agency that goes after its own people.
Right.
And if you're on this land, you are supposed to be of this land. And so it's just, we're giving, just to, again, recenter us, we are not taxing the wealthy. And we are spending money on ICE, law enforcement, and we're taking away from the average citizen.
Yeah.
And not just citizen, the average, person in this country. So it's, really jarring. And so to hear it be called the big, beautiful bill doesn't feel so beautiful.
Right.
Yeah.
And aside from the unprecedented immigration enforcement and investment, the bill also has the largest expansion of federal school choice in the history of the U.S. So more vouchers and tax cuts if you're sending your child to a private school, or just a shift in supporting our public schools.
Right.
So it's not just the defunding of the Department of Education, but it's also the pushing of these alternatives to create this like free market capitalism thing within our educational system.
Yeah.
And it's not just education, it's also the environmental areas. Basically, most of Biden's tax breaks and benefits for solar energy, for wind, have been cut. I believe they said they estimate that over 7 billion tons of greenhouse gas emissions are expected because of this bill by 2050. And this bill cancels clean energy tax credits, freezes federal funding for climate funds, weakens emission standards, and increases energy costs for households. I saw some stat that said something like the average person will be paying about $135 more a year in a few years because of how this is underinvesting in the clean energy. So between 2025 and 2023, the clean energy investment is projected to drop by $500 billion because of this bill. And because of that, wind and solar capacity will be reduced by over 60% by 2035. So we're literally going backwards.
Right.
We started moving in a direction to find alternatives, ways to, increase energy, especially now that AI and these other things are increasing the projections. They already say we're going to use 25% more energy in a few years because of these big AI factories and other things. But we're taking away the capacity to have wind and solar and for even to just put, solar panels on your house.
Yeah. And, to bring it back to the numbers, because this bill is very much about numbers. It's not just, by that's the environmental impact. And it's also because who controls the other current rare or becoming rare sources of energy? It's the folks that are getting the tax cuts once again.
Yeah.
Big business, they're the ones that are in control of energy right now. So the shift towards clean energy it affected their bottom line. And so this shifts back towards, away from clean energy and towards what was, the traditional energy, which is already run by the people who are getting the tax cuts.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Another really troubling thing related to energy was the fact that this bill opens up 4 million acres of federal land for coal mining and oil drilling.
Yeah.
So our national parks and forest reserves and sacred land that, indigenous people and groups have been caretaking for generations are now open to things that will pollute the air even more.
Yeah. And it just seems like a lot of this is to benefit the wealthy now, but the long-term implications, whether it's physical health because of the effect on the healthcare system, mental health because everyone's mental health is always affected by financial difficulty that it seems like everyone's going to be, facing. And, there's going to be no generational wealth because it's, folks are living pay to paycheck already. And this is taking away from people's ability to save, taking away from people's ability to afford anything. And so, the impact is going to be really great for the generations to come.
This is the ultimate fuck them kids bill.
Basically.
It's a big middle finger to the next generation.
Yeah, and that's such a shame because that is one of the problems is that all of this, the quote unquote kids of the future, well, the people who created and passed and are benefiting from this bill are going to be long gone.
Right.
By the time the full impact of this bill is felt. And so, it's important for us to sort of break this down because 900 pages is a lot.
Right.
And the question of, does it affect me? In this case, it isn't an answer of yes or no. The impact is, the answer to that is really like how much?
Right.
And the answer, unfortunately, by and large, is it's impacting everyone a lot.
Yep.
Anyone who is middle class, even though that's sort of disappearing, anyone who especially comes from a disadvantaged background, the impact of this bill is huge. And again, to reiterate, it is quite big, but it is not at all beautiful.
No, I think the only people benefiting are the top 20%. So the top 20% of earners gain an average of $13,000 annually from this. And then the top 0.1% actually gain about $300,000 each, those billionaires and hyper millionaires, but individuals actually earning under $18,000 will actually see their income drop after taxes.
Yeah.
And again, this bill enacts the largest Medicaid and SNAP cuts in U.S. history,
Right.
$1 trillion in reduction, and it's the largest transfer of wealth that we've seen.
Right, and I think that's important to emphasize is that this is a transfer of wealth. the money is sort of, imagine it being like a pie.
Yeah.
The slices of pie for the average citizen is getting smaller and smaller. And not just citizen in this country, but, for those who are wealthy, their piece of the pie just keeps getting bigger and bigger, and they're not sharing.
It's corporate welfare. It's welfare for the millionaires and for the billionaires. Meanwhile, the people are struggling. And I think we can wrap up with some quotes from some others who also have sounded the alarm of the historic magnitude of this. Senator Ocasio-Cortez, or AOC, she said that this bill, quote, it rips care from families to fund war and walls. And Senator Elizabeth Warren said, quote, they cheered while taking health care from 17 million people. That's not leadership, it's cruelty. So this is the kind of stuff that's happening right before our eyes, right in this moment in 2025.
Yeah, it's the reversed Robin Hood bill.
That's a good way to call it. One big
reverse Robin Hood.
Yep.
Yeah. But you know what I just realized what we didn't talk about? One of the big parts of this bill that a lot of folks are like, oh, that doesn't seem so bad. And it doesn't seem that bad, is the fact that tips and overtime are going to be taxed differently. There will be no federal income tax on tips. And for a lot of folks who get a lower wage or who depend on that, that's a huge thing. But to be clear, you still get charged the state tax, and you'll still have to pay Medicaid, and you'll still have to pay Social Security on the amount of tips you make. So it's really just the federal tax, and that could be a huge help. I'm not going to deny that, but I think it's important for folks to realize that the impact on your paycheck is probably not going to be that high, because the way that the big beautiful bill masks its impact on folks is to change the way people are taxed versus how people are paid. And so if I rely on tips, my employer is still going to, withhold a certain amount. I might just get a bigger refund at the end. But I think, so when folks read the bill and they're like, that sounds like a good thing, look closely, because unfortunately your paycheck is probably not going to go up. And you might get a little bit of a reprieve in your taxes, but at the end of the day, you didn't get the tax cuts that the CEO or the CFO of these big corporations got.
Right, and that's also something that expires in 3 years.
Right, so in 3 years that will be done. Yeah.
The most vulnerable and low-income folks in our country are feeling this the most, where literally the SNAP benefits, the money they receive for food, will be reduced. All to give billionaires tax cuts. But SNAP is being reduced by billions, but also the eligibility for programs. So undocumented people won't be able to seek these benefits. And so basically, they're willing to let more Americans and more people starve to give tax cuts to the rich.
Right. And what they're going to do is sort of make the administration of these benefits harder and more complicated. And if you were to read between the lines, it seems like that's on purpose. It's harder to apply for, harder to qualify for, harder to maintain, so that people just sort of give up on the process. And so it's on purpose. Complicating it is on purpose.
And creating chaos, defunding and destaffing the agencies like FEMA, which wasn't dealt with too much in this bill, but has been attacked. And has seen a large reduction in their force. We're seeing what the impacts of that is right now when you see the crisis in Texas. I believe it was like one help hotline where almost 10,000 people called in the past few days, but they only answered 2,000 of the calls because they've defunded FEMA and federal agencies.
Right, and they weren't even able to predict weather and communicate that weather because they had defunded the National Weather Service that would have been in charge of putting out those alerts and making those predictions. So, death by 1,000 cuts is this old sort of saying about how sometimes it's not the one blow that can take you down, but this feels like death by 1,000 cuts, in this case, financial cuts. If I relied on Medicaid, if I relied on, SNAP, if I rely on financial aid for schooling, if I rely on, sending kids to public school because I don't have the money to send them to a private school, if I rely on Let's see.
And I wouldn't even say rely on. I would say if you pay for it, because we pay taxes.
Right.
And how about our money support social welfare programs instead of bombing countries or giving tax breaks to the
or
rich?
detention centers.
Or detention centers, separating families.
Yeah. And so all of these, social programs, and they're called social programs because they impact people's communities, they impact people. They're important, but they're the first to be hit. Mm-hmm. And that, again, is also on purpose. Yep. We're not seeing cuts to the military budget. We're not seeing cuts to police budgets. We're not seeing cuts to how much senators and officials are being paid. We're seeing cuts to all of the programs that aid and assist the people in this country, the average person in this country.
Mm-hmm. To end on a more hopeful note, we definitely want to remind the people to stay vigilant and understand that, that we can hold these elected officials accountable. Mm-hmm. There are many organizations and websites that have put out the list, almost like a hit list of politicians who voted for this, which was mostly along party lines. You saw mostly Republicans vote for it and almost no Democrats vote for it. But hold those elected officials accountable. The people are still moving and protesting. I just heard this morning about Reverend William Barber in Memphis leading a protest where they carried caskets because, again, this is a death sentence for so many people protesting this bill. So people need to stay in the street and let them know, we're not going to just take this easy. But this is one of the most partisan, one of the most blatantly insensitive and dehumanizing bills and pieces of legislation passed in our lifetime, and we have to keep our eyes on it.
Right. And, for better or for worse, there has been this increase within communities of mutual aid, of organizing for each other, by each other. And so we need to keep doing that. I've said it a couple of times, but this is a time to meet the moment. And if that means helping your neighbor or figuring out how we can sort of by ourselves support each other, then now's the best time to do that.
I shade of that. Do it. Thanks for watching the Know Your Rights Camp podcast. Be sure to follow us on social media at Your Rights Camp and find more content at knowyourrightscamp.org.